Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, greetings and welcome to the March membership meeting of CSINext. I'm Mike Young, your fiscal year 2019 chapter president. And before we begin the presentation, I'd like to open it with a brief intro to some chapter business, if I may. April's presentation has been confirmed. The next month's presentation will be presented by Greg Markling, who will give us a comparison of the 2007 and the 2017 AIA 201. I encourage everyone to visit the chapter website at CSINext.org for program and chapter news. I also encourage any non-CSI chapter members to strongly consider joining us. Besides receiving notifications about learning opportunities provided as part of our monthly membership meetings, you'll receive monthly e-blasts with program information, access to your own blog, information on chapter events, and more. Now for today's program. Today's topic is Healing the Healthcare Environments and is presented by Casey Johnson of Forbo Flooring. If you have any questions, please type them in as we go, and we'll answer them either along the way or at the end of the session. At the end of the presentation, there will be a survey. If you would like to receive learning units, please fill out the survey, and if you need AIA credits, please make sure you include your AIA number. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Casey Johnson. Casey, take it away.
Hey, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I'm in Pennsylvania this week, and so it's weird presenting to, I'm sure, a bunch of happy, smiling faces. But to start this off, I'm Casey Johnson. I'm the business development manager for Marmoleum for Forbo Flooring, but I'm also our lead person on sustainable interface with our customers. As you can see, this is a well accredited presentation. Again, for GBCI accreditation, it's self-reporting and IDCEC, which whether or not there are any out there, please fill that in on your survey. But with any presentation, as we get my computer to wake up again, you have to have learning objectives, and design and material selection impacts how people heal, staff engage, and facilities go beyond meeting their needs in a competitive healthcare environment. And so in this, we really want to look at the positive and negative impacts of design and material selection on the healing environment. We want to make sure that we understand the influences that sound and light and color have on patient healing and importantly, staff satisfaction. We're going to talk about key tools in measuring this satisfaction. But most importantly, the thing I think I'm most proud of in this presentation is we do address something that is often overlooked, and that is the engagement of having a satisfying work environment for healthcare givers. So as we look at this, healthcare facilities and companies need to extend beyond the boundaries of just their built environment and reach out into the community, because they do have the ability to have intervention on a healthy lifestyle, but also the impacts of the building and the built environment can exceed not only into the community, but can also affect other communities downstream. So health is extremely important as that goes. And this isn't an old idea. If you look at this really dates back to Florence Nightingale. And if you read her writings, she really was engaged in patient healing. And from that side, she understood the power of clean water, clean air, and proper lighting. You would think that these were fundamentals for the healthcare provider, but she also saw the intrinsic value of having these, and we would hope that those continue forward on. But when we look at 20th century healthcare, you would look at this this space here and you might think, well, we'll just slap a coat of paint on it, change the floors, and we're good to go. But for me, I look at it as you have very reflective surfaces. You have, I think, an overlit environment, and I think if we went down the halls, and you also have staff disengagement from their patients by being so remotely located. And if I think we went down into the patient rooms, you would probably see more than one bed, some curtains, a heck of a lot of equipment, not a whole lot of room for family and visitors, and also a lot of easy to clean reflective surfaces. But if we if we look a little deeper, a trip to the hospital is not that different than maybe a trip to prison. If you think about it, what's the first thing that happens to you when you go through your enrollment process or your registration? They pretty much put a band on your wrist that now means that you will be recognized by your birth date. So every time somebody comes in and engages with you, the first question that they ask, they may or may not mention your name if they happen to look at the whiteboard, but they're going to ask you what your birth date is so that they're making sure that they're talking to the right person. They also take every piece of worldly goods that you brought, put them in a bag and either give them to the person with you or put them on a shelf someplace. And then we all know what the hospital gown does and how unflattering that can be and how breezy it can be on the backside should you be up and around walking. But really, what should the built environment look like? I think this is a very good example of a room that has great exposure to nature, a lot of natural light, very clean, very organized. A lot of thought was put into reducing environmental stressors such as noise and glare, a good thought to indoor air quality. But also, if you look, there is comfortable seating for family and visitors. And it's amazing. I was just traveling in Canada not too long ago, and I heard a news report that said that Canadian healthcare systems are doing away with visiting hours. And I'm thinking, gosh, I mean, visitors and patient support is so important. How could they do this? And really what they've done is you can visit a patient at any time during the day or night. And I think that's important because a person that is suffering through an illness may need support in other times than from 9 to noon and from 6 to 8 at night. So all of these things are important because what you want to do is create a surrounding that helps calm patients and strengthen their ability to cope and recover. And design plays such an important part to this. Study shows that well-designed hospital environments can reduce patient anxiety and stress and accelerate recovery, which shortens hospitalization. But good design also helps reduce the rate of hospital-acquired infections. It helps reduce that stress and anxiety. Actually improves the workflow for the health caregivers, which well-designed spaces we know in general will increase staff satisfaction and hopefully improve retention rates. And also by having more efficient workflow and nurses and caregivers closer, that will have increased patient safety, especially as it relates to falls. But since we are talking about HIA, this is a huge issue for healthcare. It is a thing that affects 1 in 20 patients, and 4% of those that contact an HIA in a U.S. healthcare facility will pass from that. Research shows, and we'll look at that in a few minutes, that there is a prevalence of MRSA and VRE and C. diff in these environments. But when you look at it, the average amount of time that a patient spends in a hospital is just under 5 days. But should they contact an HIA, that jumps up and adds another 18 days. Within modern healthcare, that added 18 days, and a lot of times there's a couple of days in between there where the patient was actually discharged and then readmitted, but adds a significant cost that is self-funded by the healthcare facility at a tune of about $25,000 a person. So healthcare facilities have jumped on board and to improve this and do the things that they can do, which is certainly creating the proper HIA prevention plan, which generally includes the washing of hands, the sterilization and the picking of equipment that can be easily sterilized, and the appropriate use and amount of cleaners and disinfectants. But there's so much more that can be done, especially on the design side of it. So if you look at a patient room, there are a lot of touch surfaces in there. And at high touch and low touch from that standpoint. But when you look at it, a lot of healthcare systems have multiple occupancy in a room. So you may have a ward that has several patients or even just 2. And you think about it, with all these high touch surfaces, inevitably your bunkmate or your roommate is the one that's going to want to get up to go to the bathroom, and certainly on their way, they're going to touch everything, the railing, the wall, all the way into the bathroom, wash their hands, come back out, touching everything on the way. And just because of power of suggestion, guess what? You have to go to the restroom. So you get up and do the same thing, and you touch all the same surfaces that they touch. So one of the biggest design interventions, and probably the most practical and successful, is the designing of single patient rooms. The second thing that is important is hand hygiene sink compliance. And to do that, it is putting the sink in a very visible spot, but most importantly, the hand cleansing station, because if you put it visible coming in, you will have more hand compliance. So design actually benefits that from that standpoint. And having the third intervention is dedicated provisions for human waste and disposal. Because in the end, if we don't do this right, between poor design and suboptimal maintenance, we can increase the risk of transmission of pathogens that lead to these outbreaks. But nobody hardly ever talks about the floor. You look at this video, or this shot right here. It shows the floor as a low touch surface, and a lot of times there is a suggestion, and even the CDC says that there's no path of infection from the floor. But my wife just recently spent a weekend in the NICU with some issues, and this was the floor that was in there, and she thought it was in this hospital she happens to work at, but she thought this was a design feature in this floor until I pointed out that I put my business card in between it, and all of a sudden she felt that the environment wasn't clean and wasn't safe, and really started looking at what she was touching. But there have been 2 recent studies done that talk about the impacts that flooring may have. The first study was done, I think, in 2016. It was done at some Northern Ohio hospitals, I think mostly in and around the Cleveland area, where they did swab tests on the floor right by the patient's bed and swab tests on the floor right by the patient's toilet. And they found in almost every case MRSA and C. diff in those. There was a second study that was also done, and what they did is they took a pathogen that was not known, or a contact agent that was not known to be in the healthcare environment. Obviously, it was safe; it wouldn't cause any infection, but they put those on the floor right by the patient bed and on the floor right by the patient's toilet, and they measured how that went through the facility, and they found that pathogen as far away as the nurse's keyboard. So if you look at it, there is there could be a correlation to outbreaks and the cleanliness of floors. And it is important to select flooring materials that are a supplement to standard infection control practices for preventing HIA. And this should be done without the use of added antimicrobials from that standpoint, and the effects that those have on drug resistance. But the next important thing is acoustics, and you may or may not see these posters around. This is, again, a poster, and this stands for Silent Hospitals Help Healing, and this is a human intervention. So it is about being quiet and turning pagers down and all of the things from a human standpoint. In fact, this is a kind of a grassroots program that was started by some Northeast hospitals here. But studies show that reduced noise levels help patients heal and recover more quickly. When you start to look at the environment, it's interesting. You start to look at how we reduce noise, but noise is measured 3 different ways, and a lot of I'll be honest with you, a lot of flooring manufacturers, when they come and they present to you, they talk about quiet footfalls and that their floor is quiet for footfalls. Well, when you actually look at that measurement is the footfalls that are above transmitting down into the space below. And most healthcare facilities have drop ceilings, have engineered the acoustics from that standpoint. But what becomes important is how reflective is the material in the space, because communication with a caregiver is extremely important. And if you have a lot of reflective surfaces, which is measured by noise reduction coefficient or sound absorption average, both kind of the same set test, but it's just different hertz levels from that standpoint, is is in healthcare is I have to understand my caregiver, and I have to be able to understand what they're telling me. And if I have old ears or very young ears, and there's a lot of reflection of sound, it just becomes a garbled mess in my ears. And I'll be honest with you, I'm getting older, and like most cranky old people, if I don't understand you, raising my voice doesn't seem to help. So I just agree with everything that is being told me, and that isn't good healthcare. It isn't good, and that's where mistakes happen, especially as it relates to discharge information. But the other aspect is sound that either gets into an environment or sound that escapes from an environment, and that's measured by sound transmission coefficient, and that's noise. So if I'm a patient and I can hear what's going on at the nurse's station, and I can hear about all the other not only what happened this weekend, but about the other patients, am I going to be as honest and open speaking with my caregiver in my room, thinking that everybody can hear me? And there's also the fact of noise breaking into an environment is very much like noise pollution, whether it's a paging system, and you always hear, and you're already in a fragile state being in a hospital, and you hear over the intercom that the code blue on, as long as, I guess you feel lucky if as long as the code blue isn't happening in your room, but you hear about that, and you actually start to worry about it, and you never really hear what the outcome is. You may hear that it was cleared, but you don't know whether it was a positive or negative outcome, and that also just starts to beat you down a little bit. And when we look at it, excessive noise really can raise heart rate and blood pressure, increase pain after surgery, requiring more medication, especially pain management, slow the healing process, and really can lengthen the stay. And believe it or not, resilient flooring can help on that side of it. You can have very reflective surfaces such as marble or glazed tile, or you can have, from a resilient standpoint, products that actually will absorb about 10% of the sound. Certainly it's not as good as carpet, but we know that carpet is rarely used in the patient environment. So staff, and this is such an important area because a lot of people don't realize how hazardous it is to work in the healthcare environment. God bless nurses. I mean, they face higher levels of cancer, higher miscarriage rates. But when you start to look at it, healthcare workers also have the highest rate of occupational asthma. When you look at it, it's almost twice the amount, or twice the rate of private industry as a whole. And this comes from a couple of different areas, but one of the areas that it comes from is exposures to cleaning products, disinfectants, increased risk of new onset from this, and a lot of nurses organizations have band together and have these little almost Bill of Rights that say that they have a right to work in an environment that is safe and healthy. In fact, when you look at maintenance chemicals, there was a study done by out of Texas, of Texas nurses, and they found that the nurses that are exposed to cleaning chemicals and sterilants that do sterilization. So we're, I guess, talking about the night nurse that's around when the floors are stripped or maintained, and have actually a higher rate of increased occupational asthma. And if you actually look at the chemicals, I mean, it's amazing. A lot of the floor strippers that are used have actually carcinogenic chemicals in them. And there was a recent, it's been a number of years, but at the National Children's Hospital in DC, a nurse practitioner dropped from what appeared to be a heart attack. It turned out to be something else, but that episode was initiated by the stripping of floors, and we see a lot of healthcare facilities that are going away from stripping floors. And it's nice when a new healthcare facility can afford a floor that is no finish, but what we do see is a lot of tired facilities because they're too scared to strip, but all they do is add finish on it and make for a much more tired environment. But noise is also a huge impact on the healthcare worker and the caregivers. when you have a noisy environment, and I don't know what kind of office you were in, I'm sure just a couple seconds ago you heard some chatter out in the hallway of the place that I'm working at, but if you're in a noisy environment, think about it. It's really like almost that drive home in commute traffic, and what happens, people start honking, you start slowing down, you start getting aggravated because of all the noise, and you actually start to feel that pressure, and that's the last thing you want to feel on the way home. But it's the same thing, you don't want to feel that at work, because it starts to fatigue you. You start to get burned out, you're emotionally exhausted, and you find that it's difficult to communicate, and whether it's yelling or just the fact that you're distracted by the other noises in the facility, is that difficulty and that frustration a lot of times lends to errors being done, and those errors are everything from missing a page for a patient that wants to get up to go to the bathroom, actually blowing by the hand sanitizing station as you walk into the room. And so compliance efforts and these things start to break down those aspects. The other aspect is comfort and ergonomics. If you look at it, sprains and strains account for about 54% of the injuries days that result in days away from work for nurses and CNAs. Strains account for the largest share of worker compensation claim costs for hospitals, and this averages about $16,000 a piece. So if you look at it, what causes these strains and sprains? And obviously it's the physical nature of the job, but really a lot of it is carried back to the fact that our nurses and CNAs are working more and more hours, and there is always discussions of nursing shortages or hospitals not willing to hire more, and a lot of our nurses, because of pay, work several jobs. My adopted son does that. And with that, you think about it, it's almost like working out. If the more you work out, what is the most important thing that you need? You need that recovery time. But if you're working a lot more hours, you have less and less recovery time. And that is what starts to break down the body, because you're looking at pushing a 1,000-pound bed. Honestly, with healthcare design and the requirements to have more and more bariatric space available to patients and more moving equipment and things like that, that these beds easily weigh 1,400 to 1,600 pounds. And it doesn't make sense to have a floor covering that easily compresses on that, because I'm going to work harder and actually improving my chance of getting hurt. And there really isn't any studies that show that flooring makes a good intervention here. In fact, the only study that I know of looked at long-term standing and flooring effects from walking. And what they found is certainly anti-fatigue mats help out a little bit, but other flooring interventions didn't work. And when you got into walking, there was nothing that was going to help from that standpoint. So what is that good intervention from that side of it is, believe it or not, it is properly fitted footwear and stockings are the number one intervention, of course, according to some of the studies that have been done on the nursing side of it. And it does help. And if you look at the standards, whether it's Z8000 up in Canada, or it's the FGI standards for healthcare design and construction, is that they recommend having stable footing and having a stable floor, because honestly, I wish I could find a picture of this, but the softer the floor, it can actually, at the end of the day, and you've got a fat tub like me. I know you can't see me, but take my word for it. I'm not the healthiest person look-wise, but if that transport person or that nurse has to push me in a wheelchair down the hall, at the end of the day, the last thing they want to do is push a fat lard like me, especially if they have to work harder because the rolling resistance isn't there because of a soft floor. But if we do this right, if we design properly within healthcare environments and select products that are easy to clean with low chemical, or we create a quiet environment, or we have, which we'll talk about in a little while, proper lighting and having a functional space with nurses close and caregivers close to their patients is that you can see satisfaction numbers go up, and certainly good design and isn't going to help with pay or work hours, but there are areas that help. And with increased job satisfaction is you do see a reduced rate in infection rates, and you do see lower and lower falls from injury falls of patients because of being closer and more engaged in the process. And when you look at it, there is what's called the 1.2 factor for this as well. Is in poorly designed and hospitals which have lower nurses satisfaction. In fact, hospitals that are unengaged in this process lose about 20% of their nursing staff. And if you take a look at, if a facility has 100 nurses and they're making about $50,000 a year, and you lose 20% of those people, that 1.2 factor comes into play and is a cost of about $1.2 million, because you lose those churn costs, which, you know, you lose a productive person, you have to train the new productive person, you have all of the search costs, and this is true in the fundamentals of good design anyways, across that. But there is a financial benefit to a healthcare system for having satisfied staff. When we look at starting to assess the patient experience, certainly in a couple of seconds, we're going to talk about healthcare surveys as it relates to HCAHPS and things like that. But these surveys are important, and they're not only important for your medical reimbursements or your Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements, but there's also this factor that is healthcare facilities look at the lifetime value of a patient. And if you take a look at the lifetime value of a household, that value is about between $405,000 and $450,000 per household. And it is beneficial because a healthcare system wants to hold a patient from the time they're born till palliative care, and be able to assess and address their needs throughout their life and the life of that household. But by having improved, we are a very consumer dominated industry, and as we look at our Yelp reviews or look at the HCAHPS study results, we want to make sure, that you're satisfied, but more importantly, that you're recommending these hospitals. And these are the information that comes out in surveys. So when you look at the HCAHPS surveys, and everybody knows that is the Hospital Consumer Assessment of Healthcare Providers and Systems surveys. Currently, it's about 27 questions. It's increasing from that, and your Medicare and Medicaid, stemming back to the Affordable Care Act, 30% of your reimbursements or penalties come from this survey. And this survey, if you look at it, is interesting, is almost very well tied to good design, because it is about communication with nurses and doctors, the responsiveness of the hospital staff. So how close were they? How clean and quiet was the hospital environment? How was my pain medication? How was the communication? Again, an acoustics issue about my medicines. Was I able to understand my discharge information? And out of that, I get an overall rating of the hospital and whether or not I would recommend this hospital. So 30% of that comes back. And if you go back to that slide I showed of my wife's room, you know, a clean room and bathroom contributes to higher patient satisfaction. It's absolutely the opposite when that room appears to be unclean, even if it's something as simple as open seams. But a contaminated patient room might also contribute to hospital-acquired infections and patients from that standpoint. And to me, that is an aspect of patient harm. And when we transition into the next part, this is the other side of the 70%. So hospital-acquired infections are in Canada considered patient harm, but they also are preventable, as are falls and medication errors. It's interesting, only about a quarter of the deaths experienced in healthcare are from HIs. The other balance of that comes from these other mistakes such as fall, medication errors, HIs, and then procedure related. And when you start to look at it, especially as it relates to medication, it is about communication. It is about having adequate lighting and being able to understand what's there, not having a cluttered environment, and also not being fatigued. Again, all things that can be helped not only by human intervention and being on top of your game, but also having a facility that helps augment that without detracting from it. Because in the end, it is about patient satisfaction. I think this quote says it best: if we can create a clean, quiet, effective environment, then we are definitely doing a service for our clients and really providing a direct return on investment. So we start to take a look at impacts, and light reflectance value is an extremely important measurement because it allows for proper daylighting, but it also allows for proper contrast, but it doesn't include glare. And glare is really a defeat for the aged eye or the visually impaired, but it also is an issue in the work environment as well, because if you have over reflective surfaces, if you have too much glare in an environment, it fatigues the eyes, and then as fatigued eyes happen, so do mistakes start to increase. But if you take a look at this patient room, studies have shown that by having access to daylighting actually reduces the stay in the hospital in some cases by as much as a day, maybe just a little bit more than that. It does provide, if you look at this room, a good restful eye level. And as we extend into the nurse area and the task areas, that there is the proper amount of lighting to be able to do a task. I don't know about you, but I've almost had to go back to reading books again, because when I read books off of my Kindle, off of my iPad, the glare is too great for me, and I start to get tired, not just because I read history and boring medical studies, but because it is fatiguing on these eyes. And there is a benefit to the circadian rhythm, to knowing where it is. I'm in a room right now, I don't know where you are, but I'm in a room right now with no windows, and unless I look at my clock and see that it's 12:30 and my stomach is telling me that I'm hungry, I have really no idea where I am from that standpoint. Lighting is important, but also good indoor air quality. There is, and I would recommend seeking this test out, but there is the COG-FX study that was done by the Chan School of Sustainability at Harvard, along with SUNY University and United Technologies, and they took 24 participants that had all sorts of everything from crisis management to creativity to middle management to code writers, and they measured their cognitive, they tested their cognitive abilities in 3 different air environments. One would be what I would consider a brown environment, just a conventional. One was in a LEED building. The other was in a LEED building scenario with the proper material selections and all of those things, but increased air exchanges. And what they found out, and this is the amazing thing, is they measured all of the things that you see on the screen, but the 2 areas that popped to me were crisis response and information usage. And when you look at crisis response in just the LEED building, there was a 97% improvement in crisis response and 131% for the enhanced air on that side of it. For information usage, it was 172% and 299% respectively for those 2 environments. And I would venture to say that it is important to understand the information that's being portrayed in a healthcare environment, but it's equally as important to be able to deal with the crisis. And again, I think air plays an important, or indoor air quality plays an important impact on that side of it. Because in the end, if we are doing this right, we can have a faster recovery rate, we can reduce the length of stay, and again, we have patients that feel calmer, more ease, and comfortable from that standpoint. But how can we further improve that? And I think biophilic design is really one of those areas. that play an important part of this. If you look at it, and yes, it is nice that there is beautiful views in the courtyard of this facility. I can tell you that obviously there's a lot of areas where you don't have the ability to put plants in, but we see a lot more oncology centers and chemo areas where those areas of facility are put in direct view of a courtyard or some nature space, because it does help with the healing process. And I think there's other design aspects that have helped, because a lot of times, especially with chemos, people suffer in silence. You know, they have a social life to some degree. They know on Wednesday they're going to see Marge in the waiting room, but a lot of times they go into a private area and suffer in silence. So we see a lot of healthcare facilities lowering the wall so that the conversations and the battle can be fought with more than one, and other cultural communities that rely on family and friends, that we see more seating so that family and friends can help with that recovery and going through that. And with that, we do have, with the access to nature, the use of natural materials, the lighting and the view on nature, is we do see faster patient recovery. But the important thing is the decreased dependency on medication, because if you look, one of those questions was about medication. And, you know, when the nurse practitioner, after they come in and identify you by your birth date, say, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how's your pain? And if the environment is noisy and there's a lot of stressors in there, you might say a 7 where it really might have only been a 5, and there you're going to be given more medication. But it also reduces the stress on staff and family, and obviously there is a cost savings to that overall. But it is interesting, you know, the use of natural materials is an important part. I could relate this to the quote here, but really, I don't know how many of you have recently looked for a home, but let's say on your list of things is that you want marble countertops and hardwood floors. And so you go to Zillow or one of those sites and you start looking at pictures and you go, oh my gosh, that house has granite countertops and it's got floors. And when you get there, it's a laminate top and an LVT floor. And how disappointed are you? Well, it's also in an environment where you expect to feel and touch nature. It can backfire on that side as well. I think really it's interesting from a color theory and in healthcare that there really isn't any studies that directly say these colors work like there are in let's say, education and things from that standpoint. But color in healthcare is dominated either by geography or by culture. And when you look at it, you find as you travel further north that you have more deeply saturated colors. But if you introduce those deeply saturated colors, let's say in Florida, it would be depressing, just like it would be shocking should you use a bright color as you get more north. And we see a lot of healthcare facilities as they design that they're selecting their color palette based mostly on region. There's a recent project, Duke Medical, where they're building their new tower, and the color theme is the four corners of the Carolinas, and so that's what the color palette is built on. But you also see a strong draw to colors from a cultural aspect, and when you look at the culture of people, and I've spent a lot of time visiting healthcare for our Native Americans or our Inuits, or up in Canada, the First Nations, that you see a lot of the colorways that are built around that tribe, that community, and we see that in inner cities as well, that you do see a strong tie to whether it's the predominant religion or the predominant ethnicity of people, and to create a warm and inviting environment here. But if you look at this corridor here, as you notice, the floor is very cool, but that coolness is offset, and the warmth is created by the use of wood. So again, I think people come to the hospital because they want to feel better, and the last thing you want in a healthcare facility is, and I've talked to some facility people and they would agree, is that if I was at home and I wasn't feeling good and I came to a place that looked like my house, am I going to feel any better? I want to come to a place that I feel is professional, clinical, not over the top, but is engineered and built that way. The other aspect of color is also improved wayfinding. Think about it. You get called to the hospital because a family member or a friend is there, and inevitably you get there 5 minutes after the information booth closes. If the wayfinding isn't done properly and you cannot get from point A to point B, it is very stressful. And the last thing you do when you finally arrive at your loved one or friend's side is they can read that stress in your eyes, and that is not good for healing. So color certainly helps from that standpoint. But another area that is important is in the use of light reflectance values and things like that is by having contrast, because in a dementia unit, I want to, and in other areas, I want to be able, if I'm suffering, I need to understand where my boundaries are. I need to know where floors end and walls begin, so there is a contrast value there. But also in behavioral health, a lot of times I can use tonal contrast or keeping things the same tone, so that if I'm in an isolation unit or if I'm in a day area and there is access to the outside, if I make everything the same tone, I'm not focused on the way out. But I can use contrast to direct me back to my room or to an activity area on that side of it. So it's important. And don't discount the fact that there are certain no colors in healthcare and certain benefits, as I described in you don't want to have agitating colors in dementia or patterns, and you certainly don't want to have agitating colors in behavioral health. But an interesting thing I found in my studies was the fact that that yellow is a horrible color to use in long-term care, because if I'm investigating a patient to see if their skin is jaundiced, a yellow wall can kind of mix that diagnosis up a little bit. But when we look at it, we are a creature of our environment, and there are a lot of studies that look at zip code and the impacts that those have on healthcare. There was a recent study done up in Canada that showed that in the same community, the have zip codes had a 20% less chance of developing a certain type of cancer that was for this region than the haves. And healthcare facilities can provide intervention to improve this. There are healthcare facilities out there that provide, because if you are in inner city, you do not have access to fresh food and to the ability to get out and safely walk and intermix with maybe some natural environment, is that so a lot of healthcare facilities are doing farmers markets, so you have access to fresh food so that you can improve your diet, and it's a great intervention. But they also have walking trails and things like that throughout the facility, which help obviously improve not only the mental well-being, but the physical well-being. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of healthcare look at the zip codes and determine what services they provide, because think about it, in an inner city, it's important to have trauma care, but not as important to have a nip and tuck center, just as it isn't important to have a trauma center in an affluent neighborhood. So zip code does play that. And as we start to take a look at building materials, we have to be cognizant of what's in there. And there, whether it's the new healthcare without harm flooring standard, or it's the or it's Kaiser with their banned list, or red list free and things like that. But there are bioaccumulative toxins out there, and bioaccumulative is just their percent, they're in the environment. The best way to describe this is the Roundup thing. Is there's a lot of suits against Monsanto as it relates to Roundup, and it's not because these farm workers or these landscape contractors are drinking at coffee break a cup of Roundup. It's the fact that they're exposed to it a little at a time, and it builds up in the bloodstream. And it's interesting that, you know, the difference of what kills a weed, or in the case of an antimicrobial, is dosage. So, a small dosage may kill a weed, but eventually if it builds up into you, it will have a negative impact. And that's why a lot of healthcare facilities are banning PVC or phthalates, have removed fire retardants, and have removed pesticides. And polyestrogens is more of a food thing, but it is finding its way into the built environment because of the endocrine disrupting factor of certain plant-based products. But I talked about my wife. My wife is extreme celiac. She is now as well allergic to soy and dairy. So we live by these. And I'll be honest with you, when I head off to the airport, if I feel I bombed this one or did great, I may pick up a donut or two at Dunkin' Donuts. But I know what we're putting into our bodies. I make that choice. But when I go into a building, how do I know? I trust you as professionals for picking products that are safe. And how do I determine that? Well, I think LEED version 4 as well, and a couple of others, they look at planetary impacts through the production of EPDs based on life cycle assessment, but also looking at what the constituents are and what the potential harm is, not necessarily the hazard of building products, which are available from C2C or HPD, which is Health Product Declarations, or the Declare label. So there are tools in place for you to do that, and I think the AIA does a nice job of educating people on how to use these tools. But we're in an environment where we're making substitutions and requests. And so the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production out of the University of Massachusetts started to look at alternatives to phthalate-based plasticizers, because phthalates are endocrine disruptors. They are tied to obesity, but they are tied to other health issues as well. But the thing you have to understand about plasticizers is they are not chemically bound to the product. That's why you see shrinkage in vinyl, is because they are placed in the product to get you from point A to point B, from manufacturing through installation, and are engineered to come out. And as they come out, they attach themselves nicely to dust. And if you look at a young adult or a young child, they breathe in enough dust daily to fill an adult-sized aspirin. And so it gives you a path of inhalation. And certainly phthalate plasticizers are tied to endocrine disrupting, similar to the way that BPA was. But these new alternatives aren't necessarily as well studied, but also are not mechanically linked to the product. They are still engineered to come out. So what's the next intervention is to go with petroleum-based plastics, and we know these are the SBR rubber products, these are the polyolefins, these are the polyethylenes, these are the PURs. But when you look at it, they are very dominant of the use of non-renewable fossil fuel resources, not only from a fuel standpoint, but from an oil standpoint. And with them come a number of impacts that are both upstream and downstream, and stay in the environment for a long time, and affect land, water, and air. So we decided to replace some of that with bio-based plastics. Well, I'll be honest with you, in flooring, and I'm not sure in other things, that is between 2 and 26% of the product. Most of them are genetically modified, so that's not even the food source that you might think that they are. Most aren't biodegradable, and even if they were, they are so linked to the other product that they can't separate themselves. They're almost like sugar and coffee. There's no way to remove the sugar from the coffee once you do this, and it's the same thing with these products, because there's still a huge percentage of them that is man-made. So if we look at EPD information and we look at constituents, you can see that based on EPD information is that a linoleum flooring will be about 73% rapidly renewable, only about 2.5% chemistry, for a lack of a better term, and about 25% filler. We move over to PVC plastic flooring, we see that It's improved. It's not bad. It's about 26.5%, but it's still about 30% man-made. But you start to see an increase in filler. And when we get to rubber, and there is really only one rubber that has any natural component to it, it is less than 10%. You're still at about 30% chemistry, but it's amazing the amount of filler that's in there. And when you compare that to, let's say, VCT, and I'm sure you guys are all rolling your eyes, but we all know it is the cheapest, most expensive floor out there. That's 84% filler. So you do have a rather expensive floor that has a rather high level of filler within the product. But that's certainly one aspect in looking at the ingredients and the safety of those ingredients. But also, you have to realize that healthcare in the U.S. is about 18%. It's almost grown to 20% of our economy, and it's 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions. If healthcare was its own country, healthcare would be the 13th worst polluting country and would be ahead of, let's say, all of the UK countries combined. So it does have an impact on our environment. And this slide, this particular screen cap came from a video called No Harm. I would recommend, if you're interested in this topic at all, by going to the No Harm video and watching the whole thing through. And certainly it talks about this aspect, but it talks about far other downstream aspects of the healthcare facility and what can be done to improve that. So if we look at this and we look at energy, you can see that different floorings have different requirements on the amount of renewable energies that they use and how much fossil fuel energy or non-renewable energy from that standpoint. And you go, okay, so case, everything has the same battery. But it's really not true. If you look at from raw material extraction all the way through production, a linoleum floor is actually somewhat is considered carbon neutral, and you go through this. So if you look at, let's say, a PVC-free plastic floor, that equates to about, for every square meter, and you have to look at, stupid me, I'm sitting here showing you what a square meter looks like with my hand gestures, but if you look at it, that's about 8 pounds of CO2 emissions per cubic square meter. And you bounce over to rubber, and that becomes 21 pounds of CO2. To put that in perspective, if let's say we're looking at a 100,000 square foot job, linoleum is going to add about 1,000 pounds of oxygen back into the environment. On that same project, if you look at PVC free, there's enough dioxin emissions that if you took a round trip ticket, I know that the Denver airport's closed, but if you took a round trip ticket from LA to New York or the other way around, your individual requirement on that one trip is about 3 30-foot balloons of carbon dioxide. You would have the equivalent of 26 trips. And if we bounce over to rubber, that same project would be about 76 round trips. So think that's the baggage that you got without the frequent flyer mileage. So there is an impact to be looked at from material selection from that standpoint. And when we look at the total energy to make different types of floor covering, you can see that different floor coverings have huge amounts of non-renewable energy. And you look at, let's say, the second one down, it is still 50-50, and you go, Casey, that's pretty good, but it's still 3 times the amount of what it takes to make marmoleum, so or linoleum products. So you can see that your selections do become a personal choice. But we also have to realize that there is a capital aspect to this, and we can't make decisions on first costs. That we have to involve everybody around, whether it's HI and making sure that the flooring is a supplement to that environment, a quiet floor, and making sure that we are creating those type of things, because those decisions are just as important, because if we do make mistakes, those mistakes can have costs beyond the flooring. And we also have to realize that sometimes we all realize that the cheapest, most expensive floor may not be the right choice, but you have to weigh the value of the cost versus the value of performance as well, and make the proper cost selection from that side as well. So when you look at whether it's the FGI guidelines for healthcare construction, design and construction or the Z8000, this is what they recommend for the selection of building materials. And you can see here that whether it's resistant to microbial growth, being non-porous, durable, but most importantly providing the necessary stability, having all you want for color and design from that standpoint, but it should be non-toxic, non-allergenic, and should present minimal glare. There is a strong push away from having shiny floors in healthcare because it is more detracting not only from a work environment standpoint, but from an aged eye standpoint. And when we focus a little bit more on flooring, you'll see that we want to minimize the risk of injury. We want to reduce noise levels. We want to have a matte or hone finish from that standpoint, and we want to do this all without generating toxic fumes. And all I can say in ending this is that from the moment you enter a healthcare facility, you are in contact with flooring. Whether you are seeking treatment, visiting family and friends, or on your way to work, you interface with the floor. And flooring can have either a positive or negative impact on the facility, patient outcomes, and staff satisfaction. And this is true with design. And I would ask that we all work together to make healthcare environments healthy again. I appreciate your comments. The one good thing about this presentation is that there are 2 pages of resource material from that standpoint. So again, I thank you very much for the time that you've given me. I'm going to open this up a little bit to see if there were any questions or if there are any questions. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Casey. And yes, there was a couple questions, and you just answered one of them, I believe. You mentioned some scientific studies that are mentioned. The question was, are those studies available? And it looks like the resource material that you had attached to this had that. So I think what we'll do is try to get that up onto the CSINext website. Was that correct? My statement correct? Is that the study material? Or
yes, it is.
Okay.
So when it's done by slide. So if you want, and I'll be honest with you, there's a lot more knowledge and study base, but the main studies are within these 2 pages of studying.
Well, great. This is being recorded. So yeah, this is being recorded. So that will be available on the CSINext website. One other question that came up is linoleum manufactured in the USA?
No, it's not. But it's interesting if you look at transportation burdens from that standpoint. Let's say, and I can only speak for our product, so I apologize, but I did do a transportation burden looking at a ton of material coming from our factory in Holland through our normal process of going to port and to wherever our closest distribution location is. Let's say it's New York City, that actually the transportation burden is substantially less for material coming from Holland than it is, let's say a ton of material coming from Holland than it is a ton of carpet, let's say, being sent up from Georgia.
Very interesting. One more question.
That's the nerd I am.
Well, one more question, and then we'll call it the end. But there was a question about, you mentioned the HSW credits being self-reported. The understanding is they can't be self-reported.
No, the GBCI,
okay.
The GBCI are self-reported. I apologize for making that mistake.
No worries.
But the HSW are through the normal process.
Okay, and that normal process, if I can just remind everybody in closing, first of all, again, thank you very much, Casey, for this. The lot of information there. Your insights on this topic are greatly appreciated. When I close out this webinar, a questionnaire will come up, a survey will come up. If you could fill that out for credits, that'd be great. And if you need AIA credits or want your AIA credits, fill in your AIA credit number or your AIA member number, and those credits should be reported and should take care of that HSW question that we had. So again, Casey, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone that attended. If you're not getting weather in your location, congratulations. If you are getting weather in your location and your city is shut down, be safe out there. Thanks again for joining. Goodbye, all.
Thank you.